would like to thank you, Commissioner Reinders, for joining us and that you accepted to open this webinar following the publication of the first EU-wide strategy on victims' rights by the European Commission on June 24th. After my preliminary remarks, the webinar will be organized in two sessions. The first one will invite different stakeholders to present their views on the strategy. And the second panel, NGOs representing so-called vulnerable groups of victims will give their perspective of the European Commission's approach. If we have time at the end, we'll leave some space for questions and answer, and do not hesitate to comment and raise your questions through the chat section. We'll do our best to answer all your questions. And I would, of course, end by thanking Victim Support Europe for organizing this webinar today with my office, as well as their contribution to victims' rights in Europe and to the strategy of the European Commission. So without any further ado, I shall give the floor to Joao Lazaro, President of Victim Support Europe. Joao, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. And first of all, thank you, Ms. Bricmont, and thank you for co-organizing with us this important event. On behalf of Victim Support Europe, I would like to thank also Commissioner Reinders, who kindly accepted to take part in this discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and dear friends, I'm very honored to welcome you to this webinar on the newly adopted European Union Victims' Rights Strategy. In 2020, Victim Support Europe celebrates its 30th anniversary. For 3 decades now, we have pressed for change across Europe, standing up for all victims and advocating for their needs: respect and recognition, protection from intimidation and retaliation, access to justice, support and information, compensation and restoration. In those 30 years, we have seen action on victims' issues come and go, often driven by short-term politics, too often failing to be followed up in the long term. To address this short-term approach, we as Victim Support Europe have called on the European Union to develop a clear vision on how victims' rights could be developed and implemented. This is why we strongly welcome the Commission's European Union strategy. It is a demonstration of the European Union's commitment to victims, which support long-term planning and coordinating implementation of policies across a wide range of sectors. More importantly, it is a strategy which has to ensure that no victim is forgotten. 2020 has been a difficult year, create a unique challenge for us all. As a global community, we are still overcoming the medical crisis and facing a tremendous economic crisis caused by COVID-19. At the same time, we are facing an increase in violence around the world, and in particular, a rise in domestic violence and gender-based violence, child abuse, cybercrime, and hate crime. We have come together to respond to this crisis, and we must come together to fight crime and support the victims. Now more than ever, we need the European Union to show its dedication towards all victims of crime and ensure that each member state fully implements European Union victims legislation, puts in place necessary infrastructure and funding, protects victims and empowers victim support organizations to deliver high quality service. As the Commission has recognized, the strategy will only be successful if we come together, listen to the challenge that we and victims face, and develop solutions in partnership. That's why today's event is an opportunity to continue this process. We will hear from different organizations about the importance of working together to improve every victim's life through empowerment, support, and protection. We also welcome comments and thoughts from everyone joining on this webinar. Victim Support Europe stands ready to work with the European Commission, the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, the Member States, victim support organizations, and civil society, and most importantly, with victims, to transform the proposed principles into positive and impactful action to make victims' rights a reality. Thank you very much. Obrigado.
Thank you very much, Joao. I will now give the floor to Commissioner Reinders.
No, thanks. I want to thank Saskia Bricmont and Joao Lazaro for Victim Support Europe for such an invitation, because I'm very happy to take part in this webinar and to talk about the first ever EU victims' rights strategy, which was adopted on the 24th June. And I have presented this strategy yesterday at the informal council meeting with all the ministers of justice for the 27 member states. So we are on time to present again today such a strategy. As you know, the European Union has a solid set of rules since 2015 under the Victims' Rights Directive. It guarantees rights for the millions of people who fall victim to crime each year. They must receive proper information, protection, and support. Furthermore, the directive strengthens the victims' procedural rights in criminal proceedings and provides that they should be recognized and treated with respect. But these rules have not yet reached their full potential. The uptake by member states is still not there. The objective of the new victims' rights strategy is to change the situation. It will ensure that all victims of crime can fully rely on their rights, no matter where in the EU the crime took place. It is about empowering victims, in particular the most vulnerable, by ensuring they have the necessary support, protection, and non-discriminatory access to justice. The current crisis has shown the urgency for such a strategy. The outbreak of COVID-19 and the ensuing lockdown has had a big impact on gender-based violence and hate crime. We have seen a disturbing rise in domestic violence, child sexual abuse, cybercrime, and racism and xenophobia. What concerns me also is that many victims are not aware of their rights or are afraid to report the crime. For example, only about 1/3 of women who are physically or sexually abused, mostly by their partners or close relatives, contact the authorities. It is crucial to give victims of crimes a voice, listen carefully to what they tell us, and ensure they have proper access to justice and support. The strategy addresses these issues, dealing with all victims of crime, but paying particular attention to the most vulnerable ones. Among these are victims of gender-based violence, child victims, victims with disabilities, victims of hate crimes, including LGBTI+, anti-Muslim or racist hate crime. The new strategy sets out 5 priorities for empowering victims to report crime, claim compensation, and to recover the consequence of crime, and working with all relevant actors in the field. These priorities are effective communication with victims and a safe environment for victims to report crime, improving support and protection to the most vulnerable victims, facilitating victims' access to compensation, strengthening cooperation and coordination among all relevant actors, and strengthening the international dimension of victim rights. We cannot underestimate the importance of support services in the aftermath of a crime. In many cases, they actually save lives. And while we cannot undo the crime, working with member states and civil society will help us ensure that victims feel safe to report crimes, take part in criminal proceedings, claim compensation, and, as much as possible, recover from the consequences of the crime. I will work closely with the member states, of course, to make sure they implement and apply the good standards of our common victims acquis. And I will not hesitate to go on to the next stage of the ongoing infringement proceedings. I also want to see member states cooperate more closely with civil society. In all circumstances, and even more in times of a crisis like now, Society needs to be resilient and ready to support its most vulnerable citizens. Stronger cooperation between national authorities and civil society is necessary to ensure that vulnerable victims can rely on the right support and protection. I'm also taking steps to better communicate to society on how we protect victims of to crime. Next year, my services will launch an EU campaign to raise awareness about victims' rights and promote specialist support and protection for the victims with specific needs. And I will promote better training on victims' rights for persons who come in contact with victims, including the police. Often, they do not know how to provide information to victims who are also often not aware of their rights in a way that it's easy to understand. This training will be done in close cooperation with the European Judicial Network and with the European Police College. I will continue making EU funding available to support victim rights projects and promote integrated and targeted support for the most vulnerable victims, such as children's houses, family houses, or LGBTI plus safe houses. And I know that to support all those actions, we need funding. So it's the reason why in the decision of the college, the commission, some weeks ago about the budget 2021, we have decided to maintain the same level of budget for the Justice and Rights and Values program that it was proposed in the first proposal of the Commission in 2018. So without any cut, because I know that there are some fears about some cuts in those programs, we have explained that it's impossible to launch such a new strategy for the victims or to think about a new action against racism and xenophobia or a better data protection policy. And I don't want to mention all the policies without an appropriate funding. So it was very clear from 21 till 27, we want at least to stay with the same amount of money than the initial proposal of the Commission. Of course, if the members of the European Parliament want to insist to receive more for the source dose program, we will be very pleased at the Commission level. But now the discussion is at the Council level. And again, I was very pleased to receive such a real support from the Commissioner in charge for the budget, Joao, and from the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, to say that we need to maintain the same level of funding that we have had in the last years and to don't see any cut in those programs. At EU level, I will set up a victim rights platform also that will meet regularly, putting together all EU actors that are relevant for victims' rights. And I will monitor and evaluate the actions under this strategy. We have a lot of actors, but it's very important to install a real instrument to organize the coordination and the cooperation and not to wait for some occasional meetings. I know that they are working together, but it's maybe better to organize such a kind of platform. If necessary, I will come forward with legislative proposals by 2022 to further strengthen victim rights. So we need first to see how it's possible to implement the actual elements and instruments that we have in all the member states. And I insist to say that, of course, it's for all the victims of all types of crimes. I know that we have paid, and it's normal, a huge attention to the victim of terrorist attacks in last years. We have paid some attention to other kind of victims, and I've said myself, we will pay more and more attention to the vulnerable victims. But the real new fact of such a new strategy is to take to pay attention to all the victims of all kind of crimes everywhere in Europe and in every kind of circumstances. I will not stop until high standards for victims' rights are met in all contexts. My services will work more closely with our international partners, such as the Council of Europe, the United Nations, and our partner countries. Closer cooperation at all levels is crucial for ensuring those high standards are effectively applied. In every EU member state, we also need national victim rights strategies. And people coming into contact with victims, I said the police, but also the judiciary, support services, medical staff, and also teachers, social workers, and society as a whole must work together. Lastly, all European institutions and bodies should join efforts with the member states and civil society to make the strategy work. The European Parliament and civil society have an important role in implementing this strategy. Together, we can ensure that all victims, I said, of all crimes, no matter where in the EU or in what circumstances the crime takes place, can fully rely on their rights. We owe it to the victims of crime, and I'm sure that it's very important to show that we are organizing the new strategy with a real attention, I said, to all the victims. Of course, we are not starting from scratch. I've said we have huge instruments at the EU level, but we need to have a better enforcement, a better implementation of those instruments, and maybe to think in good collaboration with the different actors about the way to strengthen the instrument that we have at our disposal. So I'm very pleased to receive, of course, your comments, your reactions. I know that there are some members of my DG attending also the webinar because I have some other kind of webinars today and discussions today. But again, it will be a pleasure to receive your remarks, your contribution, because we are not at the end of the process with this new strategy. We are starting a new phase in the development of all tools to give more capacity to the victims to enjoy, maybe if I may use such a word, their rights, because we need to be sure that it's possible to exercise their rights and maybe to have a real access to justice, a real communication with all the authorities, and a real capacity to receive compensation. So thanks a lot for such an opportunity to explain to you the main elements of our strategy. Of course, we are very open to discuss in detail with a lot of actors and stakeholders in the future the way to implement such a strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your introductory speech and the presentation, the global presentation of the strategy on victim rights. And you said it, Joao also said it, it's a real momentum, I think, for improving victims' rights throughout Europe, and especially in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, where we also face the problem of even more victims also of violence. And you raised it, and you raised also the need to address the specific needs of vulnerable victims, and we'll come back to it today through our second panel. They might, of course, we had to make choices and to work on specific issues today, but of course, you also said it, next steps might be needed, because the first step is, of course, the implementation of the existing rules, and you also really insisted on this, and I join you on this, because there are existing directives, and they need to be properly implemented in our member states, and this is probably one of the priorities we face when it comes to legislation. And then the next step will be to improve and to fill in the loopholes that still exist in protecting and giving access to justice for victims. And of course, that's why we are here today, to identify also the work that has to be done and that is coming. And it's just a first overview of and first reaction that we will have today on your proposal. And so we will be also interested in hearing reaction of the members of your DG that are present today at the end of the two presentations, the two panels, because what is interesting is, of course, the interaction, and in a remote way, it's not always easy, and that's also why I invite all the participants to address their questions through the chat, questions to any guests, or general remarks or thoughts, because we will try to share them as much as possible with everybody and to answer them. You also mentioned the budget issue, and of course it's a very important issue, because the EU can concretely contribute to the policies in the member states. So of course the European Parliament was also demanding at least the stability of the budget, and I'm happy to hear that you are holding on this. And you also opened the perspectives, and I think the NGOs present, associations present, stakeholders present heard your wish to put a platform in place, a victim rights platform, so that all the stakeholders can participate to further work and reflection and exchange of good practices and improving the EU legislation. So thank you again, and I'm sure we'll stay in touch in the near future.
I'm sure we'll discuss that as well at the European Parliament level, I'm sure, in the near future. But thanks a lot, and thanks again for such an opportunity, because I said I have presented the strategy to the Minister of Justice just yesterday. So we are, I'm sure, on time to do that with many other stakeholders today. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye. So I will now move to our first session on victims' rights strategy toward a new approach for victims. So this panel will look at this new strategy with a general focus and from different perspectives. We will start with Dr. Garon Bezjak, Justice and Home Affairs Counselor at the Permanent Representation of Germany to the EU. And we are very happy to have the view from the German presidency on this important strategy. Then we will continue with Joanna Goodday, who is head of unit at the Fundamental Rights Agency, who is also playing an important role when it comes to the collection of data on victims. And our third speaker for the first panel will be Levent Altan, Executive Director of Victim Support Europe. Mrs. Bezjak, before giving you the floor for 5 minutes, I would like to ask you, what is your global assessment of the strategy, and how is the German presidency willing to move forward on this important file? Thank you for joining us, and you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, because I had some difficulties to hear you. So hopefully the line will be stable, but I think this will be the case. Yes, thank you for introducing me. My name is Garon Bezjak. I'm working for the German Perm Rep. And thank you also for the opportunity to speak here on the victims' rights, and of course also on the strategy which the Commission just has published on 24th June. I have to say, at first, I would really like to congratulate the Commission on what they have launched here, because it's, for me, after I've read it, I'm really impressed by the work they did here. It's a holistic approach on victims' rights, and it's very well structured. I like that too, and it's really a roadmap, I would say, for the upcoming years, how to improve victims' rights. And I mean, it's not a secret that victims' rights are also a priority to the German presidency, and we will totally pick up on this. With a focus on victims of terrorism, which are also mentioned in the strategy as a group of particular vulnerable victims. And for instance, the strengthening of cooperation and coordination among all relevant actors is something we would like to pick up on during our presidency, because we feel that it's good to enter into a dialogue between the member states and how to improve the government-to-government cooperation with regard to victims of terrorism, which of course has very often a cross-border dimension, and this raises certain problems which has to be tackled, and so we will have a focus on that. And also, I think that the EU strategy fits perfectly into the work which has already been done by former presidencies, like the Council conclusions, which were adopted under the presidency of Finland and Bulgaria. So 2 Council conclusions. And this is also an aspect we will take into consideration in our work on victims' rights. we would like to ask member states what they have done on the basis of this council conclusions, and what should be done still, and where are the best practices in matters of cooperation and coordination between the member states and contact points. And last but not least, I think my 5 minutes are almost over, but I also want to mention the policy paper which the EU counterterrorism coordinator, Mr. de Kerkhofer, presented yesterday on the informal JHA Council. This is really also of added value, very welcome, and will also give us some guidance on how to proceed on victims' rights. And I think I will leave it at this. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to raise them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bezjak. Thank you also for your commitment and the commitment of the German presidency to consider victims' rights as a priority. And of course, it is important to work on exchange of best practices between member states. And as a commissioner raised it, one of the key issues at EU level is the implementation and effective implementation of the existing rules at the member states level. So I think it's important that the presidency can work on this through better cooperation. And I'm of course interested in this policy paper that has been presented and discussed yesterday. We'll look into it, and I agree with you with your first comment on the fact that it's a very comprehensive and holistic strategy that has been presented by the Commission. I will now give the floor. Of course, if there are questions, they can be raised through the chat. Again, do not hesitate to ask your questions to the different guests of the day. Comes next, Joanna, good day. Welcome, Head of Unit at the Fundamental Rights Agency. You have the floor also for 5 minutes. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thanks to the organisers for the invitation to speak today at this webinar. I will make 4 brief points related to the strategy, which also reflect on the work of the Fundamental Rights Agency on victims of crime. The session now asks the Victims' Rights Strategy, a new approach for victims, ? What I think having a strategy in itself is a landmark. Having a first victim strategy is a landmark in the development of victims' rights in the European Union. Like the Victims' Rights Directive, like the framework decision that preceded it, we've come a long way. But what will we be saying in 5 years or 10 years' time when we look at the impact of the strategy? And to answer that question, we need a robust, objective, evidential basis. And we need evidence not only from practitioners and experts, but also from victims themselves. So my first point is we need evidence to determine progress towards meeting the goals of the strategy. At the moment, it's a fantastic strategy, but we need that evidence to collect it to look at its impact. Now, for over a decade, the Fundamental Rights Agency has collected a body of evidence on the fundamental rights situation of victims of crime in the EU. We do this in 2 broad ways, through social legal desk research with both practitioners and victims, and we do it also through our large-scale surveys. And of course, one point I want to underline here is that we know from our large-scale surveys that so many victims, of course, do not report crimes anywhere, and we need to remember that fact. And also because we've done surveys on violence against women, on the LGBTI community, on anti-Semitism, on hate crime. The results of these surveys really are an evidential basis that should feed into the strategy, because we can see extensive reference in the bulk of the strategy to these so-called vulnerable groups. It's very extensively embedded in the strategy as a key reference, and that will be the second session discussing that. So I would say if we do look at this strategy, we do see a far more comprehensive reference to diverse victim groups in this strategy, which is a very good thing. But I'd also like to highlight a point that the Commissioner just made about this is for all victims. So another point I want to make is that the Fundamental Rights Agency we will be releasing results from our survey called the Fundamental Rights Survey of 35,000 respondents. The results we will release towards the end of this year, and it asks people about their experiences of crime. So within that data, we will be able to unpack the experiences of different members of the general population by socioeconomic background, by age, by income, by gender. Again, that's the kind of evidence that can feed into the strategy to see what the member state results look like. And also we have another piece of work called Justice for All, which will very much reflect the different provision for victims in different member states, which reflects again each country's historical focus on victims. And it will tell us a little bit more about why is it that certain member states are doing very well in implementing the Victims' Rights Directive in some areas and less well in others. So the lessons learned from FRA's work can feed into how we work with and ensure the effectiveness of the strategy. And this brings me very quickly to my second point. That is, when reading the strategy, I think we need to recognize the diversity of victim groups and experiences, but at the same time, we need to ensure that these groups do not compete for attention and limited resources. FRA's research has shown a commonality of experience that is shared to a greater or lesser extent between different groups, such as unreporting, such as underreporting, such as feeling that you will not be listened to, that you will not be respected when you report. So the strategy could adopt a new approach for victims if it recognises not only diversity, but commonality of experiences, and within that, the recognition of shared rights. Moving on, my third point is, of course, is that when you read the strategy, it's very much written in the time of COVID. The text reflects that. And I think, if anything we've learned from COVID is that it's pushed justice to become virtual, which has had both positive and negative consequences for victims. If we move further towards the virtual delivery of justice, particularly if COVID persists, then the impact on victims and defendants, of course, needs to be carefully assessed with respect to ensuring that victims can enjoy the full range of rights set out in the Victims' Rights Directive. Also, of course, as already been mentioned, COVID saw a peak in domestic violence, which NGOs very much alerted the state to, and some states did effectively respond. And we also saw COVID increasing online hate against specific groups. This brings me to my final point, and that is that the new strategy needs to look closely at the new tools that are available to us, tools that can both assist victims and do harm. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean the digital world, from social media through to the dark web. The strategy under its first section does refer to the online world, but we need to take this on board across all the different areas of work of the strategy. So the digital world presents both new tools that perpetrators can employ to harm victims, and we have witnessed this with the proliferation of online conspiracy theories and misinformation that expresses itself as hate against specific groups in society, such as the Jewish community. And digital tools also make mass scale and repeat victimization against groups or individuals easier. For example, a woman can receive multiple abusive texts from an ex-partner every day using these new tools. So these are just 4 general points to reiterate that I've picked up when reading the strategy. And from the Fundamental Rights Agency's own partial interpretation of the wealth of text in the strategy is that we do need robust, objective evidence to assess the impact of the strategy. FRA stands ready to provide that evidence to support NGOs and member states and the EU institutions when they roll out the strategy. We need to recognise the diversity of victims. The strategy makes that very clear, but we also need to recognise the commonality of victims' experiences. We need to see the lasting impact of COVID-19 on virtual justice. And we also need to recognise new tools, both to empower victims through the digital world, but those tools increasingly can abuse victims. There is reference to this in the strategy, And that's all very encouraging. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this first comprehensive assessment. I think you're right by saying that we need evidence in order to evaluate the impact and the effectiveness of the strategies, and this should be true for all our legislations. We need impact assessments, and we need to give the tools right now to evaluate the effectiveness of our policies. And this is key, of course, and you play a role in this. And of course, we'll also plead for support to improve the need to collect evidence and data on this issue. And you raised it. What comes back very often is first of all, that many victims do not report. And this is also something important to collect, but I'm sure there will be further reactions also when it comes to collecting data, evidence, and information coming directly from victims, because I know there are different participants today that that also do that on the field as associations, as NGOs. So thank you very much, and I will give the floor to our last guest for the first session, which is Levent Altan, Executive Director of Victim Support Europe. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia. I think one of the dangers of following the Fra and Joanna Goody is that I feel like just saying what they said. Joanna always gives a very good and comprehensive presentation of some of the key issues. I think from Victim Support Europe's side, the first thing we'd like to say is we welcome very much the strategy. It's something we've been calling for many years. Certainly what victims and the victims agenda tends to face is, has faced over the last 40, 50 years is start-stop politics. So we do need something which allows us to have a comprehensive look at the issues and to work collectively together in a long-term way. And we're confident that this represents, we think, a step change, and that under the leadership of President von der Leyen and Commissioner Reinders, we will see substantial changes in the way that we work for victims. But it is a first step, and we have to make sure that this strategy is not just on paper alone. And as others have said, this means that we need to have some clearly defined goals that go beyond just the strategic statements, but look into a detailed action plan, and which looks at the expected impacts as well. It's not enough to say that we will have a legislation or we will have funded something, but what will actually be the impacts? And what are the indicators to be able to carry out the analysis? Because we need to evaluate and we need to monitor to see if what we're doing is working or not working and why it's not. So I think that's the first part of really making sure that this strategy is effective and works well for everyone. And one which also, by the way, addresses the most difficult topics. It's one of the reasons why you have to have something like a strategy. Issues such as compensation are too often pushed back for another year and another year, and we've had 16 years without action on compensation. We really need to use the strategy to address some of the most difficult issues, such as legal aid. It has to also be something which is inclusive, which allows all actors to be at the table, both institutional actors, European actors, governments, and civil society themselves, and of course victims. Victims have to be heard and have to be at the table, not just represented by organisations, but as individuals themselves. So we're very positive about what's been put forward. But we do hope that there will be sufficient funding, and Commissioner Reinders has reassured us on that. I think we did have fears that there was going to be, we're going to be experiencing these cuts. We know that civil society and NGOs are facing significant pressures at the national level, and we shouldn't underestimate how important EU funding is to their survival and to their continued action at the national and European level. So we hope that continues. We hope actually that there will be additional funding, for example, for helplines such as the 116 helplines, which still don't exist in every member state, despite the decision having been adopted many years ago. But we mustn't be too reliant on projects alone. We mustn't be too reliant on just looking at good practices which are established in one or two places. These good practices have to become common practices across the whole of the EU. And that means partly about funding, but it means about embedding those practices across all countries into the actual work of our practitioners. And as Joanna said, we need to look at innovation and technology, and we need to also carry out effective research and have the statistics on hand to see whether what we're doing is working or not. So those are some of the general approaches. In terms of the actual topics themselves, the starting point is the implementation of the laws. And let's be clear now, the EU Victims Directive has not been sufficiently implemented. No, not one single member state has fully implemented the entire directive. We have fundamental problems with that implementation, in particular with victim support, which is a gateway right. If you have victim support in your country, you are significantly more likely to access other rights. And it means that there are 5 countries, for example, which do not have any generic victim support services across the whole country. So these are major blockages. So we have to make sure that these laws are implemented. We have to make sure that the Commission carries out enforcement action and supporting action. We need to also make sure that they are active in establishing and maintaining safe participatory justice. Too often, victims face very harmful situations when they enter the justice system, and we need to put in place innovative and effective practices to protect victims. We have to work for all victims of crime, as well as for the most vulnerable, and that's clear. It doesn't come out so strongly in the directive, but again, we're happy to hear that the Commission has emphasised that all victims of crime will be a focus of the strategy, and that's extremely important. An area that isn't so spoken about is the resilience of individuals, and we really, really promote action which will help all individuals be strong and be able to cope and recover. And this is something that's important not just for crime, but for all traumatizing events. And as we've seen in under the COVID lockdown situations, that there are many people who are experiencing traumatic situations, and they need help with that. Resilience is a key, individual resilience is a key, as is the ability to come forward, not just to report the crime, but there are many, many barriers to being able to come forward and seek help. We mustn't just remove those barriers, but we must also reach out. We must help individuals to know what they can do to help. They need to understand the impact of crime. They need to help understand how to identify those crimes, and they need to know what to do. So there's a lot that we can do and the EU can do to support that process as well. And one of those key aspects is training, which we're very much happy that the European Commission has focused on. But that training has to be fully embedded. It can't be based again on projects. We need to ensure that the national training academies of the police, of judges and others actually incorporate training in a compulsory way every single year for every single judge, prosecutor, lawyer, so that they are fully understanding of the situation of victims. And this training has to be developed not just by European institutional actors, not just by the training bodies themselves, but in conjunction and cooperation with civil society, with the people who work with victims themselves. I think we're also very supportive of action on protection orders. This is an important and extensive move that the Commission is putting forward. We know that protection orders are life and death matters, and in the member states, not every country has the same level of protection orders, and they don't implement those orders in the same way, and that costs lives. So the more that we can do in Europe to ensure a level playing field, to ensure that every person is effectively protected, the better. Just on a final point on compensation, again, we're extremely pleased that the Commission is promoting action on compensation. But again, let's be clear, we haven't had action for 16 years. And in many countries, the way that the compensation systems are operating either wholly fail victims or they actually harm victims as much as they help them. So we need to do much more to make sure that our compensation systems do provide fair and appropriate compensation, and that they don't harm victims in the process. Overall, we're extremely happy with what the Commission has proposed, and we're very much looking forward to taking part in the next steps and hopeful that the next 5 years will produce very positive, real outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Levent. Yes, I hope so too. I really hope so too. And well, the presentations today show that there is still a lot of work to be done, but that it is possible. I also heard commissioners saying that it would activate the infringement procedures towards member states that do not apply the European standards. So this is also something important that has been said. I will give you the floor back because you are moderating the second session of today, and we decided to work on certain categories of so-called vulnerable victims, although I also heard Madam Goodday saying another approach is possible. So maybe we can come back to her proposal later on. But today we choose to focus on certain categories also to try to understand better the specific situation of those victims. So I'll give you the floor back and have a good second session.
Thank you, Saskia. Indeed, so in this session, we will focus on a range of different groups of victims, often considered particularly vulnerable. We felt it was important to give the floor to the many different groups, and I think what we'll find is that there are specific needs and circumstances for those different victims, but there is a lot which is in common and which we can work on together to achieve some real change. Without taking the floor for too long, I'll first of all introduce you to Juliana Santos Wahlgren, who is the Senior Advocacy Officer at ENA, which is the European Network Against Racism. Over to you, Juliana.
Thank you, Levin. Thank you for the invitation. Sorry, just cut my video. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation and also for the initiative to be able to have this discussion timely before the beginning of the vacations, when the future plans are still being drafted. So it's a timely initiative. I want to salute you for that. I will not be repeated. I will not repeat of what the other colleagues said. I think we have already touched upon the positive aspects of the strategy. We very much welcome some progress, like minimum standards on victims' physical protections, access to justice for migrants independently of their resident status, funding of the communities, community-led organizations and community-led support groups. So this is very much welcome. However, I would like to touch upon 4 points that for us seems to be lacking in the strategy and probably could be used as food for thought for the future negotiations and also in the review of the implementation of the directive, but also of the strategy. First of all, for us, it's really important to mention that there is need to have a better definition of hate crime. We know very well that the framework decision is not also very well implemented, is not very well harmonized, and we think that the question of the bias indicator is something that is still missing when victims report crimes to the police, and the way it's reported is not efficient enough, first of all, to protect them as victims of hate crime, and second of all, to proceed with statistics and figures on evidence on how victims are being protected or discriminated, or on what is lacking in this process. So we very much urge for clearly and mandatory outline guidelines on how bias indicators could be reported by law enforcement authorities, in guidelines, manuals, in policies, not only in trainings, but also in one more harmonized document tool that could be of help of police authorities, for example. Another thing that I'd like to touch upon is the question, there is a lack of intersectional approach in the strategies. As Joanna mentioned, there are many diversities, many groups, many pluralities, many victims. The way a hate crime is manifested against a Muslim woman is not the same way it's manifested against a Roma man. So we know that there are specific needs that need to be addressed. But beyond that, there is also a lack of understanding on which are the 4 dimensions of intersectionality that we group still the individual plus the structural, the institutional, and the historical. And this is where racism persists, is because we never touch upon what is beyond the individual aspect of crime, what goes beyond on how one person attacks the other or discriminates the others. So there is a need to review and have a better understanding how the structure discriminates and how the institutions also are perpetrators of crime. So it's very important that when you talk about intersectionality, we can move from this individual perspective and can get a better reflection, to get better answers on how to act when institutions themselves and structures themselves are perpetrators of crime. Then I would like to touch upon something else that is more on the subjective arena of the recommendations, which is the question when you talk about information. Information is key. Information is power, but do not forget that people do not report not only because they are not informed, but mostly because they do not trust the system. They do not trust the authorities. They do not trust the law enforcement and judicial authorities. So this mistrust leads to a lack of reporting and reportings of hate crime. So here we have to rebuild the trust with the community. You have to rebuild the trust with the victim. And in our latest shadow report that was launched last year, what we see in a very systemic way is something that you call the justice gap. So what we see is that significant cases of hate crime that are reported as hate crime will never be judged as hate crime, because throughout the investigations, throughout the prosecution phase, leading to the sentences, everything that is there to prove that is the component of the bias equations of hate, they try to dilute it, or they try to remove from the interpretation of the investigation phases. So what we see is this second victimization, was also the decriminalization of the victim throughout this process. So this phenomenon of the justice gap needs to be reviewed and incorporated in a fully fledged strategy, because it's not only about being informed about the system, but trusting that these victims can be protected by the systems. Another point, because then I touched upon again, and it's my final remark when I talk about intersectional approach, is that we have to also talk about police brutality, when the police is the perpetrator. And here, in many cases of hate crime, touching upon Black minorities, people of color, migrants foremost, even in control of implementing terrorist measures, there are many procedures that are based on ethnic profiling that is leading to police brutality. And here is a problem. How we create a strategy to be sure that there is a multidimensional understanding of hate and racism, and we have to understand that the structures discriminate, and the structures and institutions, they are also actors of crime. So there is a lack of response in this regard. And here there is something that is urgent, because we saw very well in the context of COVID, how many cases in Europe, not talking only about George Floyd, but also in Europe, how many cases were reported of police violence because they were trying to secure health measures during the pandemic. So with these 4 notes, I would like to close my intervention, and we really hope that the strategy in the next steps can bring this multidimensional approach of racism, and also take into account the fact that we should go beyond the individual as perpetrator, but also we should move towards an understanding what we do in institution and structure discriminates. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. I think, now I don't know if you can hear me there. Yeah. Thank you, Juliana. I think the points that you make are particularly important with respect to the way that we record complaints, and how this also comes down to statistics as well, and perhaps the barriers and the reasons why we're not recording these bias indicators. If you don't get recognized and the crime doesn't get recognized in the appropriate way, you've already got a first barrier to achieving and seeking justice. And not just that, but then it breaks down on this fundamental issue of trust. So these are problems which are self-perpetuating and also continue to build on each other as well. So thank you for those comments. Without further ado, I'll move on to Michelle Lavoie, who is the director of PICUM, which is a European NGO that works on behalf of undocumented migrants. So over to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you, Levant, and thanks to the organizers, obviously, for having this very timely and very helpful discussion. I want to borrow a few words that I think some of the other speakers have referred to. The first one is a landmark. So PICUM is a network of more than 165 organizations, and many of our organizations work with people who have experienced domestic violence, victims of hate crimes, labor exploitation, and other crimes while they're undocumented. So we actually see the strategy as a landmark in EU policy for explicitly recognizing how being undocumented or having irregular migration status makes a person more vulnerable to victimization. Basically, once you're undocumented, you're always going to risk immigration enforcement measures if you seek help or justice if you've been a victim of crime. You're more likely to be punished than your perpetrator. And all of this fosters impunity and repeat victimization. And we can draw on some studies that have shown this. So one of our members, the Latin American Women's Rights Service, did a study in 2019 called The Right to be Believed. They distinguish between perceptions and actual experiences. So 62% of women who had experienced gender-based violence in the UK that they were interviewed for the report felt they wouldn't be able to get support because of their irregular immigration status. 54% feared the police wouldn't believe them because of their status. And then when actually what had happened, the percentages were still less, but they're still very high. 27% of women who had reported to the police had their residence permit questioned, and 18% were arrested for immigration issues because they had actually reported crime to the police. In the area of labor exploitation, we also see worrying figures. So the Fundamental Rights Agency's Severe Labor Exploitation Report from 2019 found that 57% of the 237 migrant workers who were surveyed did not report their cases of severe labor exploitation to the police because they were afraid of losing their jobs. They were afraid of being arrested or being deported. This is contrasted with another report from the organization Flex in the UK, which found that over 300 undocumented workers in Belgium have reported cases of unpaid wages to labor inspectors without suffering immigration consequences. All of this since 2010, under the concept of professional secrecy. So meaning that they can have an agreement between the labor inspector and the immigration enforcement to have a firewall, so there's no sharing of data. However, such a system does not exist for victims of other crimes in Belgium, where the police retain a duty to report. So we see, as other speakers have mentioned, somewhat about this fear that this and the trust, the close relationship between the police and the immigration authorities in many countries undermines the faith or the trust that the local police are interested in the safety of communities. Given the overlap between migration status and being a member of a racial, ethnic, or religious minority, there's an additional layer of policing to the experience of communities in color who feel over-policed and underprotected. So we think, actually looking at the Victims Directive, that Article 1 is very clear that people should be able to seek protection and justice without fear. And the way to do this in a lot of experience is to install firewalls. So meaning that there's the separation between access to justice and immigration enforcement, that the police in this case would not be obliged to hand over the personal data of the person reporting the crime when they're undocumented to the immigration authorities. This policy has been established in the Netherlands, called the Free In, Free Out policy. And there are also 5 EU countries, so the Netherlands, France, Greece, Italy, and Spain, that make available a residence permit for undocumented survivors of domestic violence to encourage them to access protection and justice. So I wanted to just conclude here with 6 brief recommendations to how we can actually support the real implementation of this strategy concerning undocumented migrants. The first one is firewalls. The Commission could support member states' implementation of these firewalls so that people could feel safe and secure when they're undocumented, when they go to the police to report a crime. This is already an action point in the strategy. However, as we've also heard, law enforcement is typically not viewed as a partner, but as an obstacle in terms of protecting undocumented migrants. So this would actually require a lot more close cooperation with law enforcement to prioritize safety and rights in their interaction with victims. The second one, as has been also repeated previously, is strengthening the evidence base. We should invest in research that looks at good practices. Actually, in the area of access to justice for undocumented, there is a very small but slightly growing body of research in this. So we actually do need to invest more in finding out what is the evidence on the ground. And this comes especially from the city level. Amsterdam, New York, Montreal, they all have examples that we can be looking at and maybe even potentially replicating of safe reporting. The third area is dialogue and exchange. Once we have more knowledge about these good practices, we have to support exchange amongst them at different levels, the national, the regional, the local, so that we can have more discussion about what they are and how they've been rolled out. The fourth one is support these practices or promising initiatives. Support is by promoting them, but also by financially supporting them. So it was very good to hear at the beginning about the potential EU funding, but this should also be considered for examples like these, which are concerning undocumented migrants. Unfortunately, many of the EU funding mechanisms specifically leave out undocumented migrants. So we have to be careful about that going forward, that any potential funding on victims of crime could also be extended to initiatives that look at undocumented victims of crime. The fifth one is policy coherence, ensuring that EU policy domains in this area, the victims of crime strategy and DG Justice, are not overridden by other policy areas such as DG Home's migration policy. So we have to make sure that the victims' rights are primordial here. And this could actually be considered with the new victims' rights coordinator. They could have a new, an important role in making these connections, as well as the Equality Task Force working under the auspices of Commissioner Dalli, which can assure an intersectional approach. And then just the last recommendation is the commitment to engage vulnerable individuals and communities. This should be a commitment and a clear process to understand affected individuals and communities' realities, their needs, and to tailor suitable responses built on trust and empowerment. We think it's very interesting to hear of the new EU platform on victims' rights, as well as obviously the new victims' rights coordinator. They're very important starting points. Civil society has had a lot of experience with other DGs and other thematic areas of civil society platforms and coordinators, so it could be useful to see an exchange to hear what has worked well, what has worked not so well from some of the other examples from within the Commission. But we do feel that there should be meaningful participation with relevant stakeholders and to recognize the critical role that NGOs and civil society in general have in reaching and supporting marginalized groups. So just to conclude, I'd like to thank you and very much welcome the opportunity to work with the Commission and all of the partners on the call today and others so that we can support the implementation of this new strategy so that at the end we can really achieve true impact for all victims of crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I think this is an extremely important point and one that we mustn't forget, that there's no such thing as the perfect victim, and sometimes it's easy to focus on just some groups because they are easier to focus on And justice is a fundamental right which is there for all victims, and in the same way as the presumption of innocence is there for every single suspect. These are difficult issues, and this is exactly why we need to have a strategy. This is why the European Union has to join together to discuss these issues and to make sure that victims can access those rights, and that the fundamental barriers which are there, not just for undocumented migrants, but for many other kinds of victims, such as the homeless, such as sex workers, that we overcome those barriers and make sure that everyone can seek the support and justice that is their right. So thank you, Michelle. I will now hand over to Borja Aru Astren, who is the Project and Policy Officer over at Age Platform. Thank you, Borja.
Thank you, Levent, and also thank you to MEP Saskia Bricmont for the opportunity to have this event and to share our views on older victims and how the EU strategy can be beneficial for them too. So when it comes, well, first of all, AGE is the European network of organizations of older persons. We have around 110 members across the European Union. Our members work on a variety of topics. As I will say later, maybe victims' rights is not the topic they are working more on, so there is also some homework to do from our side. So when it comes to older people, we find the big challenge of invisibility of older victims, and also great, let's say, situations of vulnerability, especially in the context of long-term care. So older people receiving care are particularly likely to experience situations of abuse, violence, and neglect. So elder abuse, what we call elder abuse, is that is specific to older people. It can be physical, psychological, can be sexual as well, financial, and can also include neglect. And well, there is a key element of the fact that it happens in a relationship of trust. So trust with a care professional, but it can also be a link of trust with a relative providing informally care. And we know that 1 in 4 older people with high care needs experience maltreatment every year in Europe. According to World Health Organization data, around 2,500 older people die every year on average because of maltreatment. And there is a big problem of underreporting, and that's the case also, of course, for other victims as well. According again to WHO, only 1 in 24 cases are actually reported of elder abuse. So there are lots of obstacles. Elder abuse often happens behind closed doors, and therefore, well, that explains to some extent the little reporting we see. There is also a clear asymmetry of power between the victim and the offender. And also there is sometimes, again, there is this relationship of trust, sometimes even a family link that makes it very difficult for other people to actually report the situations of abuse they may be experiencing. Also, we know that in many EU countries, actually, elder abuse is not considered yet to be a crime. And as long as elder abuse is not considered a crime, the value, for example, or the impact or the enjoyment of the rights that are included in the EU Directive on Victims' Rights will be limited. Also, actually, policies on elder abuse are very limited. Public campaigning on elder abuse is also very, very scarce. And support services for victims of elder abuse are actually unavailable or often unprepared to offer support to victims of elder abuse. So that's concerning elder abuse. But when we look at other types of offenses or crimes, we observe a tendency to overlook the needs of older victims. Often they are left out of the picture. So, for example, if we take gender-based violence, often public campaigns, statistics focus on younger women or adult women, but tend to forget actually older women. So in many statistics, they are actually not reported. And in some others, people over 60 are put in one single group. And we know that there may be a need to have a more nuanced approach to victims over the age of 60, maybe taking, little like by 10 years, like as it happens for younger victims. So that's quite a big problem, because whenever there is a campaign or there is any kind of policy on violence against women, we see that older women are very much forgotten, left out of the picture. But this is not only the case for gender-based violence, that's the case also for other kinds of crimes and offenses. And we know there are reports, we have reports from older victims that report being taken not very seriously by police and justice systems, and they feel that's because of their age. So there is some kind of discrimination, institutional discrimination against older persons when they report crimes or offenses. The very good news, and we are very happy about it, is that the EU strategy on victims' rights includes older people as one of the groups in situations of vulnerability. To be honest, the language in the strategy is not the language we would have chosen, because there is a problem about, it is important to talk about the vulnerability of some groups of victims, but without really giving the impression of frailty of, this kind of very negative framing and ideas that actually have a strong impact on the sense of dignity of older persons. So now it is about making sure that older persons are actually really part of the implementation of the strategy through both specific and general actions. It is important, as Joanna said, not to fight for resources against each other. What we know yet is that older people have often been left off the picture in EU funding programs or projects like the Daphne calls on violence. Elder abuse has been very, very few times included as one of the targets of those calls, and we know that there is a strong need for more data. That's really urgent in elder abuse and more generally on older victims. For instance, on gender-based violence, when it comes to older women, we always use the same report that is already 9 years old, and we have only that as kind of the only European report we have on violence against older women is that one. So there is a need for more data, and we hope that the strategy can deliver on that. Also that whenever the activities announced by the strategy and also announced by the Commissioner today, such as, for example, the EU-wide campaign on victims' rights, we need to make sure that older victims are also part of the picture, and we would like to be consulted on how that kind of campaigning is presenting older people and how it's trying to target older people as well, knowing that we have the challenge of reaching out to those, for example, living in care homes or being in a relationship of care in their own homes, for example. There will be a very challenging, it will be challenging to reach out to them, but we can really help with that. I referred to that at the beginning, the fact that, well, it is essential, and that's mentioned in the strategy, and that's something I took away from the cooperation we have had with Victim Support Europe over the past years. It is essential to work in agency kind of cooperation with different kinds of or stakeholders, including police and justice, including, in our case also, it's very important, care professionals and also informal carers, and support services as well. It is important that older...
Can I just ask, we're running out of time. Would you be able
Sure.
to finish in the next minute?
Yeah, we'll finish now.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. So it is very important for us that organizations of all people are part of the conversation, but for that we have to build the capacity of our own members, and we are relying on the fact that the new strategy is a good opportunity for us to further build our main network's capacity to deal with matters about victims' rights. And I will stop it here.
Thank you so much for that, Borja. I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's so much to talk about on these issues, but we're also running out of time. I think many of the points you've raised are extremely important. We see lots of intersectional issues, questions around aggravating factors which aren't being taken into account, so that there's much more to discuss, and I hope we will be able to do that. I will quickly now, because we're running out of time, I'll hand over to Anne-Sophie Linkerbeck, who's the Human Rights Coordinator at the European Disability Forum. And I think, Anne-Sophie, I just said your name wrongly, but over to you.
That's perfectly fine. I absolutely understand. Thank you very much for having the European Disability Forum at this very interesting webinar so far. And also thank you very much to Victim Support Europe for repeatedly involving us, to ensure that the voices of the most excluded victims are also heard. EDF is very happy with the strategy because it's the first time that the rights of victims with disabilities are really considered, and so we're happy with this progress. As you know, victims with disabilities face many of the barriers that other victims also face, but they have some additional barriers. Some support services are not accessible, for example, for a wheelchair user, or you might have a person with intellectual disability that needs the information in accessible formats, such as easy to read. We also often, unfortunately, hear stories of women with disabilities that face stereotypes. When they go to the police and they report a crime, they're often not believed. And then what other speakers also already mentioned is the lack of training, of justice and police personnel, and the fact that they often lack the information on the needs of people with disabilities. So the EU legislation on victims' rights was a very first positive step, but for us it was a bit mostly ineffective. And so we hope now that the rights will become a reality through the strategy. As the strategy really recognizes that people with disabilities are often victims of hate crime, and that their access to justice also might be more difficult by the fact that they're often deprived of their legal capacity. If you have no legal capacity, you have no legal personhood to, for example, start a case before court. You don't exist before the law. So this is also very complicated for this group of people. The strategy also includes the obligation for both the European Union and all its member states to comply with the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. As you know, this is the first international human rights treaty that both the EU and all member states have ratified. So this is also a very important recognition for us. But as the colleagues were saying from H Platform, now it's a matter of implementation. And so we're really looking forward to how the strategy will ensure accessibility of communication, accessibility of the built environment for victims with disabilities. It will need to be considered in all actions taken by the Commission and Member States, from the promotion of support services that will need to be accessible, also to the e-justice portal that should be accessible. We also will need for specific people with disabilities the provision of reasonable accommodation, which, for example, we can think of a mainstream support service in a rural area or remote area of a country. We cannot expect them to be fully accessible to all persons with disabilities, but we would expect that they would take reasonable accommodations, as we call them, for specific cases. For example, if a deaf person comes to the support service, that this organization can call up a sign language interpreter to actually accommodate their communication needs. We also hope that in implementing the strategy, the Commission and other stakeholders will reach out to the most marginalized victims. There's people with disabilities and victims living in institutions, closed institutions, such as psychiatric hospitals or prisons, other forms of detention, and always with a specific attention and an eye for women and children with disabilities, because they're always still in a more vulnerable position than persons with disabilities in general. We also hope that the EU and the member states will focus on awareness raising and on training. As already said, not only of justice personnel, but also from the very beginning when a person goes to report a crime, so from the police officers to all legal professionals and to all those involved in victim support services. And lastly, as already has been the case, we hope that representative organizations of people with disabilities will continue to be involved and heard at both the European Union level and the national level. For instance, we hope that the Victims' Rights Platform will include organizations of people with disabilities, and we're very much looking forward to continue working with you, Victims Support Europe, with all the colleagues of the organization and with the European Commission and all stakeholders to make that the implementation of the strategy is successful for all victims. So thank you very much for giving us the floor, and I hand it back to you, Levent. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Sophie, and thank you for keeping things so succinct and to the point. I think the amount that we need to do for these particularly vulnerable groups is huge, and we mustn't forget both the UN and the Council of Europe conventions and how we need to take those into account. I think your point about access and accessibility is extremely relevant. I think we struggle to have that access for able-bodied people and those without mental disabilities. So those with those kinds of disabilities, it's extremely difficult, and of course those in institutions, whether they're disabled or not, face significant barriers, and they are amongst the most hidden and most vulnerable. So there's a lot to be done and a lot that must be done for those. So thank you for that intervention. And finally, not last but not least, I will hand over to Akram Kubanchibekov, I hope that I pronounced that one rightly, who's the Senior Advocacy Officer over at ILGA Europe, and they work for LGBTI community. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Lab, for introducing me. And We also would like to thank on behalf of the ILGA Europe for organizing such a timely conversation around the victims' rights strategy, and for inviting us to participate to share our opinion on the victims' rights strategy. ILGA Europe, first of all, we would like to say that ILGA Europe welcomes EU strategy on victims' rights to advance protection of victims' rights in the European Union. And we would like to highlight that by including LGBTI victims throughout the EU victims' rights strategy, the Commission takes a clear stand on stepping up the protection of the LGBTI people. And we are very happy about it, and we hope that the European Commission will ensure that initiatives set out in the strategy will be fully implemented and will contribute to better protection of LGBTI people and other vulnerable groups, as it was highlighted. And in general, it will be also beneficial to all victims of the crime. But at the same time, we would like to say that in the implementation process, the Commission should take into account that while there are similarities, as it was highlighted by others, in the way that crime impacts on all in all impacts, or maybe some vulnerable groups of the victims, that there are some particular differences for different groups, and for LGBTI people, especially due to historical and current stigmatization and discrimination, and their lived experiences, and it also may differ from one country to another in Europe too, especially considering the recent developments in Poland, for example, and in Hungary. So and also we would like to say that the most important for us is the implementation of the current and enforcement of the EU legislation in the field of the protection of the victims, because without proper transposition and the implementation of the current EU legislation, it is impossible to ensure the proper protection of the vulnerable groups too. And here I would like to focus on the experiences of the LGBTI people, because LGBTI people mostly suffer from the hate crimes. And as Juliana already mentioned, that we would like to see that that the clear definition of the hate crime, what is the bias, would be given to the so it will be defined at the EU level, and also it will be translated into the national level. So it would ensure that that LGBTI victims of the hate crimes are protected, and it will send clear message to the perpetrators, especially of the biased crimes, that these groups are protected by the government, and that the government, the state will see the bias-based crimes as a so against their law. So that would be our recommendation, and we are very hopeful to see that in the action plans. It's a one, and then the second one would be for us especially important. It's that the definition of family members within this Victims' Rights Directive, and especially in the transposition to the national level, is LGBTI inclusive, and especially the support to the victims, to the family of the victims of the crime, are reflecting the realities of the LGBTI families and rainbow families. And of course, for us also, this is very important, that as others here highlighted, because most of the issues I wanted to talk were already multiple times highlighted. Underreporting is very important issue for the LGBTI victims of crimes because of the historical distrust between law enforcement and the LGBTI community, because of the excessive policing of the LGBTI by the police, as we can see from the history, and it was criminalized. So, and in order to ensure that the reporting, the rate of the reporting is increasing, the European Commission should encourage the member states to build a trust between LGBTI community and other vulnerable communities, as it was highlighted by the PICUM. Also that to trust between the communities, vulnerable communities, and the police to ensure the higher rate of the reporting. And also they should encourage victims to come forward to report the crimes. For that, they should empower through the trainings, through the information, and I think the foremost, the first message which European Commission should translate that that they should feel that they're valuable and they can be heard, and so that that people will step forward and report the crimes. And also, of course, the training, because of the distrust to the
could I just ask you to wrap up in the next minute, please?
Yeah. The last one I think would be like that to the access to the services, especially for the LGBTI people, and especially for the trans victims of the crimes and etc. It's these safe spaces are not accessible for trans women, especially the safe spaces for the women are not accessible, and to make them accessible, and plus the member states and the Commission should ensure that the personnel of the support service providers services are trained. And on that I will stop. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Akram, and sorry to have to interrupt you. I think you have many important points to put forward. I think as you say, there are many common issues that we're having to deal with across these different areas. I think there's much research which is around behavior change and secondary victimization, but increasingly we know that we have to also deal with these problems at the institutional level and even now at the leadership level. And I think we're seeing much more around the politics of division rather than inclusion. So we have a lot to act on, and the European Union is a union of partnerships. So I very much hope that we can continue to work together and push for the changes and the development of trust together. I will now hand over to Saskia. Unfortunately, I think we've run out of time for questions and answers, so I will just hand over to Saskia, who I think will make some final concluding comments. Saskia.
Yes, thank you very much, Levent. I see also the comments in the chat. So yes, sorry about the fact that we won't be able to have an open exchange, but I'm sure we'll have other opportunities to do so. So again, I want to really thank all our guests of today for your very interesting speeches and presentations. And we see how important it is to talk about specific vulnerable victims also, because we see the important intersectionality of this issue. So I think we all agree that we have a comprehensive set of rules on victims' rights, even if there are still gaps and inconsistencies. We hope will be filled by this long overdue strategy, of course, and by the work that is still in front of us. The outcome of this victims' rights strategy is globally positive, I think, and we need to work now hand in hand with the Commission also to seek to improve the existing shortcomings. it has been said, and I also think it is important to mention the future appointment of a victims' rights coordinator, to have this approach really highlighted by some of you on the needs and the rights of the victims. This needs to be central and key with the services concerned and with a better coordination. If, of course, improving legislation is important, we said it, the implementation remains key. And it's also about political will. And so I again welcome the German presidency's commitment to work further on the issue of victims' rights. I think also that the European Commission should continue to be stringent when it comes to transposition and implementation, as member states do not fully comply with the already existing rules. I think I also want to raise an issue that we didn't raise in the second panel today, but it's the integration of the specific situation of detainees and migrants. It has been said, of course, by PICUM, but I think it's important to have them as targeted groups. And here I make a political point, because I can only acknowledge that the European Commission is thinking out of its own box when taking them on board. Again, implementation will be key, and those political forces using the fate of victims as a political argument without tackling the issue of all victims' rights is no longer acceptable. On a less positive note, I want to stress 3 points that are not enough addressed in this strategy. It's the situation of victims of member states, authorities and administration, including police violence. It has been said, and I think we really need to work on this. The effective access to justice, and I heard accessibility to justice and services must also be reinforced. And I really hope that the legislative work in the European Parliament will help to strengthen these dimensions. I want to echo the call made by civil society and organizations today to be closely associated to the implementation of the strategy and the redaction of the forthcoming proposals. Grassroots knowledge and the participation of the victims themselves are key in that process. So finally, again, thank you to all our guests, and this is just the start of a future work. I see that cameras have been reactivated, and I really want to warmly thank you again for participating. Thank you to the more than 100 participants that were with us today. Again, keep chatting if you have further questions. We'll take them, we'll communicate them to our speakers and try to come back to you with their answers. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you again, and we'll stay in touch.